Dr. Chomsky is here, and you are welcome to start asking questions. Any area that you are interested in? Thank you.
Dr. Chomsky, I'd like to, I've seen, I'm familiar with your views, and I've seen, I remember when you were on Bill Maher, and I've seen other expressive reviews. I know you have strong views on the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. And I think I have two things I wanted to ask. One of them was, we hear today about, well, if they would just sit down and negotiate, maybe they would get somewhere. And my view is there's nobody, the Palestinians don't have anybody legitimate who actually speaks for all of them. I'm not sure the Israelis do either. Do you see any possible positive outcome?
Negotiations.
If they would negotiate.
Well, the standard line here is that the Palestinians are refusing to negotiate and that Israel wants to negotiate without preconditions. But the facts are very clearly exactly the opposite. Israel imposes crucial preconditions. The one precondition is that, and it's a central one, is Israel and the United States, as they work together. They impose the condition that the negotiations have to be under the U.S. aegis. That already eliminates the possibility of negotiations. For the last 35 years, the United States has unilaterally blocked this political settlement. There's an overwhelming international consensus, includes about everyone relevant, in favor of a political settlement. We know the terms, two-state settlement, international border, various adjustments. The first, it came to the United Nations Security Council in 1976, brought by the Arab states. The U.S. vetoed it. Came again in 1980, U.S. vetoed it. The vetoes, dozens of vetoes in the General Assembly, constant. So for the U.S. to, if there were legitimate negotiations, they would be organized by some respected neutral party, maybe Brazil. And on one side you have the U.S. and Israel, and on the other side you have the world. Then you could have negotiations. That's the first precondition, guaranteed to ensure that nothing happens. Second precondition is that the settlements must continue, the settlement expansion must continue. That's Israel's position, the U.S. endorses it. The settlements are all good. There is no question about that. Every relevant international authority has declared them to be in violation of the core principles of international law. That's the International Court of Justice, the Security Council repeatedly, in fact the State of Israel itself concedes it. But they say they can go on as long as the U.S. backs them. So the second precondition is they must be able to continue. Third precondition, which Israel isn't very explicit, is that a lot of the areas where it's building, it plans to annex. Well, that's, of course, multiply legal, but that's another precondition. And if you have negotiations under those conditions, well, of course, they're going to get nowhere. And therefore, Israel and the United States would like them to continue. They'd like them to continue because they're guaranteed to get nowhere, as they've been for dozens of years within this framework. And meanwhile, Israel, with U.S. support, can systematically take over the parts of the West Bank that it wants, leaving the rest kind of cantonized, and can maintain the siege of Gaza. That's the criminal siege. So that's fine with them if negotiations go on. The picture that's presented here is almost the exact opposite of the facts. There's no problem for Palestinians in negotiating. In fact, they formally accepted the international consensus back in 1988. Before that, they pretty much accepted it. It's the U.S. and Israel which reject it. And as long as they have the power and they can continue to do what they like, there won't be any resolution.
So, if the first precondition, say, the Palestinians in the world sat down, I guess what I wonder is, because it seems to me the Palestinians don't get along with each other. Hamas versus Fatah.
Actually, there's conflicts.
That's something that also have to be resolved.
Right now, there's a unity agreement organized by Egypt. The United States is strongly opposed to this. Israel is strongly opposed to it. They don't want them to be able to unify. For one thing, that would eliminate this pretext, and it's only a pretext for not having elections, for not having negotiations. And for another, it's worth remembering that since the early 90s, the United States and Israel have been dedicated to separating Gaza from the West Bank. That happens to be in direct violation of the Oslo Accords, which they signed at the same time, which declared that the two are a territorial unity. But the U.S. and Israel have been systematically trying to separate them. They've gotten pretty far in it. And there's a good reason for that. It means that if any kind of Palestinian entity is ever set up somewhere in the West Bank, scattered cantons or whatever, it'll be imprisoned, because the only access to the outside is through Gaza. If it's sectors of the West Bank alone, they're imprisoned between Israel and the Jordanian dictatorship. So sure, the U.S. and Israel want to separate Israel from Gaza, the West Bank from Gaza. Incidentally, why the split between Hamas and the West Bank is there. It's there for a reason that should interest us. In January 2006, the first free elections in the Arab world took place ever. Free elections in Palestine, carefully monitored, recognized to be free and fair. The day after the election, the U.S. and Israel instituted harsh sanctions to punish the Palestinians. Why? They voted the wrong way. And you're not allowed to do that. Our concept of democracy is you do what we say or else. So they voted the wrong way in the first free elections, and the U.S. and Israel immediately moved to disrupt them. In fact, the U.S. immediately, there's a standard procedure if elections come out the wrong way, organizing military coup to overthrow the government. So these immediately began with Fatah to organize a military coup led by a Fatah strongman, Ahlan, to try to overthrow the elections. Hamas preempted the coup, and they took over the West Bank. Well, that just, for the U.S. and Israel, that's totally intolerable. It's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election. To block a military coup that's going to restore what we want, that's incorrigible. So the siege and the attacks sharply escalated. Most of the Palestinian, the United States along with Europe, dismantled the legislature. In fact, most of them are Israeli jails. That's the first freely elected legislature in the Arab world, dismantled under U.S. initiative and pressure. And so sure, they're separated, and not just by laws of nature. But we've got our dirty hands in it all the way through.
Do you think things could have been, nobody's giving me a dirty look. Do you think things could have been different if in the early 70s, after the occupation was settled, the Israelis treated
This is a pretty open society. All the documents are there. You just have to look. They don't get reported in the press, but they're there. So in 1971, President Sadat of Egypt offered Israel a full peace treaty. Nothing for the Palestinians. This is before the Palestinian issue pretty much entered the international agenda. So the only reference to the Palestinians was their refugees should be treated nicely. So a full peace treaty in return for Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories. Now the only part that Sadat cared about was Egypt. Israel was occupying the Egyptian Sinai. In fact, it was not just occupying it, it was driving out thousands of farmers, Bedouins, driving them into the desert, destroying towns and villages. It was initiating plans to establish an all-Jewish city, Yamit, should they accept security or should they insist on expansion? It was a choice, security or expansion. They decided on expansion. They rejected Sadat's offer, said they would not withdraw from Sinai. The crucial question, as always, was what the United States would do. Well, there was an internal debate going on in the U.S. government at the time. This is the Nixon administration. The Secretary of State, William Rogers, was in favor of this offer. In fact, it was pretty much official U.S. position at the time. So he was in favor of it, but Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor, was against it. His position was what he describes as a stalemate. We should have no negotiations, just force. There was an internal bureaucratic battle. Kissinger won out. In fact, replaced Rogers and became Secretary of State. The U.S. went along with Israel's preference for expansion over security. That incidentally led directly to the 1973 war, which was a very close thing for Israel. It almost led to a nuclear war. Big business. Kissinger realized at that point that you can't just dismiss Egypt as a basket case. He initiated what was called the shuttle diplomacy, and finally ended up with the peace agreement at Camp David in 1979, in which the U.S., this is now Carter, the U.S. and Israel essentially accepted Sadat's 1971 offer, though from their point of view in a much harsher version, because by that time the Palestinian issue had entered the international agenda. So in 1979 they had to have a kind of at least rhetorical reference to Palestinian national rights. Now it's interesting that in U.S. Diplomatic history, that's regarded as a great triumph of Carter and Kissinger. In fact, it was a diplomatic catastrophe. Their rejection of the offer in 1971 led to a major war, could have been a nuclear war, being quite close, a vast amount of suffering and destruction. Finally, they more or less accepted the U.S. and Israel, what they'd rejected in 71. But try to find that in any account of this in the media. Come to read careful scholarship. First thing about it, it's all on print. But so sure, there were possibilities in 1971.
Let me ask one last thing, then I'll be quiet.
Incidentally,
Students,
Jordan made the same
Yes.
proposal in 1972,
Please.
and there wasn't even a response. But sorry, go ahead.
No, I'll let somebody else.
Yes.
And if nobody asks, then I'll ask the next
Sure.
one.
Any of the students out here? Yes, please.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to stay on the same topic.
Talk about
I'm sorry, I don't mean to stay on the same topic. I'm sure there's other questions that need to be asked. But, when you were talking about how our form of democracy is kind of like do what we say or else, and I know you're here to speak to the larger question of the United States and the United Nations. You still can't hear me? I'm sorry.
Stand up. Talk loud.
I know you're here to speak to the larger question of the United States and the United Nations. Would you feel that this whole situation that you're outlining here with the Israelis and the Palestinians effectively either tarnishes or delegitimizes the United Nations in terms of the fact that the settlements are a direct violation of international law, their occupation of the Golan Heights and the Shebel Farms is deemed illegal in the international community, and yet nothing is done about it?
Are you asking, does it delegitimize
The United Nations, in a way.
Well, in the United States, it delegitimizes the United Nations. In the rest of the world, it delegitimizes the United States. In fact, the United States is, in Europe, for example, is just a recent poll on threats to world peace. The greatest threat to world peace is Israel. Now, they're not allowed to ask about the United States. They're too afraid to raise that question. But if people are asked, they say, sure, the United States is one of the greatest threats to world peace. And if you go outside of Europe to what's called the global south, the vast majority of the world, that's not even a question.
Yes, please.
Dr. Chomsky, it's a pleasure to see you here in person. I see your appearances with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! My question is, with regard to your book, which was published in 2006, The Failed States, ever since the publication of this book, developments pretty much reaffirmed your views that United States is a failed state, or United States is a failed state. Into dimension, two aspects. I would rather pretty much prefer failing states. One, with regard to the decision last year, Citizen United, Supreme Court versus the Federal Election Commission. One, two, United States reactive policy towards the Arab Springs, like Egypt's revolution in Tunisia. So with that, I would like to see your views, whether that's still the same since the publication of your book about 5 years ago.
Let's take this morning, it's a good place to start. Take this morning's New York Times, the front page story on the U.S. attitudes towards the complexity of facing U.S. diplomats with regard to what's happening in Egypt. There's a huge popular uprising fighting off the military. And they say that creates a real dilemma for the United States because there's a conflict between the U.S. Passion for democracy and the realistic understanding that we have to support the military. Well, what's the evidence for the passion for democracy? Zero. That's pure ideology. It's as if we're living in North Korea. You know, your leader says so-and-so, you repeat it. The passion for democracy doesn't exist. In fact, the U.S. is very frightened of democracy in the Arab world. And there's a very simple reason for it. You can easily figure it out. Take a look at polls. There are careful polls done by U.S. polling agencies, top U.S. polling agencies, do regular, careful studies of public opinion in the Arab world. They're not reported in the press, but you can be sure the planners know about them. They're released by Brookings Institute, people like that. You can find them on the internet. They're easy to find about them. Just take a look at the polls and remember what democracy is. A functioning democracy is a society in which public opinion influences policy. Right? Doesn't do that, you know, like Iran can say we have a democracy. Egypt can say we have, Saudi Arabia can say we have a democracy. If public opinion doesn't influence policy, well, it's not democracy. Well, suppose public opinion were to influence democracy in Egypt. We know what public opinion is. 90% of the population thinks that the greatest threat to Egypt is the United States and Israel. Opposition to U.S. policy is so strong that about 80% of the population thinks the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. But they don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. Second, other questions show that. But given the enormous threat posed by the United States and Israel, they think maybe that would balance it. About 10% think of Iran as a threat. Are those the policies the U.S. wants to see implemented? Well, so of course the U.S. will oppose democracy. The same throughout the region. And it's not terribly surprising. In fact, it's not just the United States, the same with Britain, the same with France, and so on. But it's more important in the case of the U.S. So there's no passion for democracy. That's a fabrication. You have to say that. You have to even believe that if you want to be a respected intellectual media commentator. You have to get yourself to believe it. But these are incidentally things that Orwell wrote about, interestingly. So everybody here, I'm sure, read Animal Farm in 8th grade or something. But I suspect that none of you read the introduction to Animal Farm. The reason is it wasn't published. It was found 30 years later in Orwell's unpublished papers. I mean, actually, you can get a new edition. Sometimes it's in there. And the introduction is pretty interesting reading. What the introduction says is, he says England shouldn't be too complacent, because free England is not that different. And he says in England, quoting him now, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And then he goes on to talk a little about how it's done. Partly it's because the press is owned by wealthy men who have every reason not to want certain ideas to be expressed. But the more important reason is a good education. So if you had a good education, you go to Oxford and Cambridge, so on. You just have instilled into you the understanding that there are certain things it wouldn't do to say. He could have gone on to say it wouldn't do to think. Unless you have that instilled into you, you're not going to make it in the world of influence and respectability. So the end result, he says, that in England, without the use of force, unpopular ideas can be suppressed. We're roughly the same. Don't want to exaggerate it. I mean, it's not 100% by any means. Societies are still free and open, so things leak out. But it's a pretty strong tendency. You see it all over. And that's why you can get the regular claim, not just in today's New York Times, but even in scholarly literature, it's all over the scholarly literature, that the U.S. is dedicated to democracy. Take a look at the record. You find it's the exact opposite. Actually, Citizens United is a case in point. Citizens United sort of carries forward, you all know what that ruling was. Citizens United was a Supreme Court ruling in January 2010. I won't go through the details, but in effect it gave corporations carte blanche to essentially buy elections. They do it anyway, but this kind of opened the doors more. There's very good literature, political science literature on this. There's a political scientist who's one of the really top political scientists in the country, Thomas Ferguson, has been working for many years on what he calls the investment theory of politics. There's a book about it called The Golden Rule, a couple of years ago, lots of articles. The basic theme is that elections are occasions in which groups of investors coalesce and invest to control the state. And he shows, I think, pretty convincingly that for about 100 years, peer reviews, you can pretty well predict who's going to win an election by the amount of campaign funding. And more interestingly, you can predict the policies that are going to be followed by looking at the nature of the campaign funding. We just saw that in 2008, dramatically. Obama's main funding support came from the financial institutions. And his policies ever since then have been to give away everything to the financial institutions. And this is a particularly gross example, but it's what happens consistently. And Citizens United just opens the doors to that even more than before. So sure, that of course undermines democracy, but the population knows it. You go back to 1990, the population was extremely disillusioned with the electoral system. I mean, there's a lot of hype about how Reagan was this wonderful hero. Everybody loved him. But Reagan's popularity was quite low. In 1999, it never was reached very high. In 1992, right after he left office, he was, the polls show that people were asked their opinion about living ex-presidents. Reagan ranked right at the bottom, barely above Nixon. The highest incidentally was Carter, and Reagan was way down at the bottom. A huge propaganda campaign has produced this image of Reagan, the idol, the great this and that, but the population never bought it, and rightly. In fact, even in the election that Reagan won in 1984, I think 1% of the electorate said they were voting for him because they thought he was a real conservative. And about 2/3 of the people who voted for him said they hoped his legislative programs wouldn't be enacted because they opposed them. These are, spectacles run by the public relations industry. doesn't expect a political figure to live up to the promises they make on the campaign. These are, in fact, they make different promises to different audiences, very carefully organized by the PR agencies that run their campaigns through focus groups and says, you should say this kind of thing here, so on and so forth. And nobody sensible believes a word. And of course, they never live up to it. And they avoid issues. Issues are almost totally avoided, serious issues. We see it right at the moment. It's right in front of our eyes. Today, the deficit commission collapsed, as everyone assumed it was. Well, why is there a deficit commission in the first place? About 70% of the population thinks the deficit isn't a real problem. And they're right, it isn't a real problem. The large majority of the population thinks the real problem is lack of jobs. So there ought to be a joblessness commission. But the banks, they don't care about jobs. They care about the deficit because they're afraid that maybe sometime in the future the deficit might lead to slight inflation. And inflation isn't good for banks. Inflation is good for borrowers, not for lenders. So they want to make sure that doesn't happen, so therefore we have a deficit commission. Although the population has to be quite right about this. All right, suppose you look at the deficit. Suppose you decide to pay attention to the deficit. Are there ways of dealing with it? Population overwhelmingly has ideas about how to deal with it. First of all, get the rich to pay taxes, which they don't. They're way down from what they used to be. So that's number one. Preserve benefits. So don't touch Medicare, don't touch Social Security. Cut the military budget. Whatever's going to come out of this is going to be the exact opposite. And in fact, there's one topic which you're just not allowed to talk about at all, which would eliminate the deficit immediately. In fact, give us a surplus. The United States has a totally dysfunctional healthcare system. It's the most dysfunctional in the world. It has about twice the per capita costs of other industrial countries, and it has relatively poor outcomes. And of course, it leaves about 50 million people uninsured altogether. Well, if the United States simply had the healthcare system of some of other industrial countries, it was not a utopian ideal. Not only wouldn't we have a deficit, we'd have a surplus. But you can't touch that because the insurance companies and the banks and the financial institutions, they want an unregulated, privatized healthcare system with huge administrative costs and profits and so on and so forth. So therefore, that isn't even discussed. But you have here a kind of a gulf between public opinion and policy, which is dramatic. And yes, that's exactly what you'd expect when elections are bought. The Citizens United just carries it a step forward.
Let me divert your attention, Dr. Chomsky, from political topics to your scientific work for a moment. You rejected Klein's behavioristic interpretation of language and all that goes with it. But your thesis, that human beings as species are born with this linguistic acquisition device, LED, as you call it sometimes. Now, this is a kind of a rationalist in that idea thesis, but Aquinian might say that it is an underdetermined thesis, like the behavioristic interpretation of language. What would be your response to that?
Underdetermined
By evidence.
Every empirical statement is underdetermined by evidence. Physics is underdetermined by evidence. Everything outside of arithmetic is underdetermined by evidence. I mean, even good.
So when you compare it with behaviorism, do you think your position fares better, and why?
Because it explains things. The behaviorist position collapsed because it just couldn't say anything about anything. In fact, if you actually look, behaviorism, which was rampant in the 1950s, pretty much collapsed from within. There were a lot of criticisms, but academic professions have ways of defending themselves against criticisms. just close the door if you're in a cocoon, as my wife says. We're all familiar with that. But it's a little harder in the sciences than outside the sciences. But even in sort of quasi-sciences like psychology, it's possible. So it just fended off the criticism, disregard, no matter how powerful they were. And some of them were really strong. Could go into it. But what actually happened is kind of interesting. The most respected behaviorist position, the most developed one, was B.F. Skinner's radical behaviorism. Well, Skinner had students, and the students believed every word. They were dedicated. In fact, the students, a lot of them had drifted off into animal training. I don't get the ages right, but probably some of you are at an age where you saw things like Flipper on television. That was Skinner's students, training animals to do funny things. And it looked like, he seemed to have the answer to how to train animals, so okay, let's make some money out of it. An interesting thing happened. His main students, you want to look it up, it's Keller and Nancy Breland. They were the ones who trained Flipper and all those other things. They made an interesting discovery. They discovered that when they were training an animal, they could get everything to work, have the right reinforcement, get the right responses, everything worked the way it's supposed to, up to a certain point. At a certain point, it started to regress. So, for example, they're training circus animals. They trained a pig to pick up a coin and stick it in a mailbox, and then it would get whatever pigs like to eat would come out the bottom of the mailbox. And the more you ran the reinforcement schedule, it's fine, the pig did better and better at picking up the coin and so on, up to a point. After a certain point, they found that the pig started rooting at the coin, what pigs do, and it delayed the reinforcement, and the pig got hungrier, so therefore it rooted more and more, which delayed the reinforcement even more. In fact, the pig would have starved to death if they hadn't called off the experiment. But that happened over and over. And what they found was what they called instinctual drift. The animals, the humans thought they were training the animals. The animals didn't think that at all. They thought they were training the humans to do something that gave them what they wanted. But they were kind of working it into their own instinctual patterns. And after a certain time, the instinctual patterns took over. Skinner was training pigeons to play ping pong. Well, you can do that because pigeons peck. So you can train them to change their pecking around up to a point, then they just start pecking. Interesting. And this happened over and over. In fact, when the people started finally looking at the lab experiments, they discovered that what was happening was that the scientists were cutting off the experiment at the point where the learning curve started to deteriorate. So as long as everything was working fine, you have an experiment, then you publish the paper, and everything starts to regress, so you don't publish that work. Pretty soon the whole thing collapsed. There was just nothing going on. It was just animals modifying slightly their instinctual behavior under, if these guys want to feed them. In fact, it was a famous joke in the Columbia undergraduate newspapers, strong behaviors department back in the 50s. The joke was a couple of mice in a cage are talking to each other, and one of them was an experimenter outside, and one says to the other, "Boy, that guy, I got that guy conditioned. Every time I tap on this thing, he gives me a pellet." That's approximately what was happening. So it collapsed. And when it got the language, it was just ludicrous. There was nothing. On the other hand, there's still plenty of work of a similar sort. I don't say the discussions are over by any means. In fact, in the cognitive science literature, the dominant opinion is that there really is no such thing as language. It's just a collection of cognitive processes that do other things. I don't think that's a tenable position, but it's certainly an argument.
Thank you. He's from Egypt, one of our students.
I have a question regarding to the current situation in the Middle East, specifically in Egypt. So when the revolution started in January, the military chose to be neutral and stay next to the people. But later on, like last week and Friday, he started to open fire against people and use the tear gas against the uprising. And in my opinion, I think that they don't have enough experience to run the state. But at the same time, they're not clear with people. They don't have like a specific day for the free election.
Who doesn't have a specific?
The military.
Military, oh, they have a pretty specific.
No, for the presidential election, they don't have.
What?
They never mentioned that.
Well, they don't mention it, but.
And they always say, we don't want to stay in power, but at the same time, they're not really, I don't know, I don't think they are very serious about it. I don't think they want to stay in power. But why they are not serious about the elections and just, giving a country to a
Well, they're
civilized?
happy to have elections as long as it doesn't undermine their power. I mean, look, the military has been running the country for 50 years, and they're not going to give up easily. It's not just the political system. They're all, I'm sure you know all this, they're all embedded in the economic system. They own a large part of the economy. I mean, it's like asking General Electric to say, I'll go become a carpenter. They're not going to do that. They're going to hang on to what they have as long as they can, and they know that the West backs them. Western powers want the military to stay in power because they're worried about popular feelings. So sure, they'll try to hang on. I mean, the Tahrir Square movement in the early days was, you can kind of understand it, but they regarded it, tell me anything you don't know. They regarded the military as an ally in the struggle against Mubarak. Well, okay, the military was willing to give up Mubarak. We'll give him up and we'll put somebody else. But they're not willing to give up power. And sooner or later, it's not happened. They were obviously going to come into conflict with the popular movement. And there are other serious terms. The military would like to run an election in which the only participants, effective participants, would be the old Mubarak party, NDP, and something, and the Muslim Brotherhood, who they figure are pretty tame. But they want to make sure that the elections are under control.
So do you think they are interested in having like a military president in the future?
I don't care if it's a military president, as long as it's one who sort of doesn't shake up the power system. I mean, that happens all over the place. Take, say, South Africa. Getting rid of apartheid was a major achievement. On the other hand, if you look at how that achievement was realized, it was not very pretty. First of all, the United States and Britain were supporting the apartheid regime almost to the very end, quite openly. They changed policy around 1980. So, for example, the ANC, National Congress, was considered by the United States and Britain to be one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. Nelson Mandela just got off the terrorist list 2 years ago. He can now come to the United States without a special dispensation. But around 1990, the U.S. and Britain decided to let the apartheid regime go. Western corporations also wanted it to go. South African white business community decided it's time to get rid of it. What they wanted to do was to keep the old regime in place, but with more black faces in the limousines. And that's pretty much what happened. The old regime is in place. For the majority of the black population, things were either as bad or worse than they were before. But there's, there are black faces in the limousines. Well, that maintains the basic power system, just modified so it's less racially explicit. Actually, the same happened here. Pretty much what happened here is the civil rights movement.
Yes, please.
What are some of your suggestions to improve the United Nations?
Sorry.
I said, do you have any suggestions in improving the United Nations? And
Suggestions about
how to improve the United Nations?
how to
Improve the United Nations?
improve.
The United Nations.
The United Nations.
Yes, in like response to like crisis.
Well, I think the best way to improve the United Nations would be for the United States to stop destroying it. I mean, if the United States stopped undermining it every time it gets in the way of U.S. policy, that would be a big step forward. There's plenty wrong with the United Nations, incidentally. I mean, it's a wildly overloaded bureaucracy for a lot of countries. The United Nations ambassadorship is just a cushy job. You can walk around New York, buying things on fancy stores and so on. And I've testified at the United Nations a couple of times. But nevertheless, the UN does some good things. And the main impediment to its doing decent work is that primarily the United States, secondarily Britain, third France, just won't let it function unless it keeps to their demands. The United States is extremely resistant. But in fact, if popular attitudes in the United States toward the UN, if they were implemented, that would improve the situation a lot. So the population of the United States is quite supportive of the UN, not the elites. A considerable majority of people in the U.S. think the UN ought to take the lead, not the United States, in international crises, and think that the U.S. ought to follow the will of the majority, even if we don't like it. In fact, the majority even think we ought to give up the veto. But these policies are so remote from elite concessions, they can't even be uttered in public. But if policy moved in that direction, the UN could function better and still do plenty wrong with it.
Yes, who was next? Yes, please.
We still have capital punishment in 34 states in the U.S. We still have capital punishment in 34 states in the U.S. How do you feel about the death penalty, especially after like the Troy Davis case?
I'd say it's one of the few. I mean, there are other countries that have the death penalty. Saudi Arabia, not a very nice country. But among the kind of countries we'd sort of like to think ourselves as being somehow part of, almost none have the death penalty. And in my view, the very idea of it is an atrocity. I mean, the state should not have the authority to murder people. That's just the beginning. I mean, it's not just the death penalty. Incarceration is a real scandal in the United States, and it's a recent one. I mean, a lot wrong in the past, but up until, say, the 1970s, the United States was pretty much like Europe in levels of incarceration. A little bit toward the high end, but not off the spectrum. Beginning around 1980, incarceration levels started to increase. By now, it's about 5 to 10 times as high as any comparable countries. And if you look at what's driving it, it's mostly a very large part of it is drugs. And these are victimless crimes. You pick up a kid on the street with a joint and goes to jail. Furthermore, it's extremely racist. The people who get, send white businessmen to jail for snorting cocaine. It's poor kids in black ghettos. And then it gets very punitive, like 3 strikes you're out, so you stay in. And the incarceration system, unlike other countries, it doesn't try to rehabilitate. It just creates crime. You throw people into a situation with criminals, and so they come out with no skills, go back to crime. And that whole system is actually designed, I think, to essentially get rid of a superfluous population. There's pretty close race-class correlation in the United States, not perfect, but close. And starting in the 1970s, the economy changed dramatically. It changed towards financialization and offshoring production. So farcical drug war, which has nothing to do with drugs, but is a technique for sort of getting rid of superfluous population. And by now there are other factors involved, which criminologists call a prison industrial complex. The building jails, which is a lot of it's privatized now, it's a very profitable enterprise. And in rural areas, say in New York, maybe Pennsylvania, in rural areas, it's one of the main sources of income of prison systems. In fact, I was walking through the Upper West Side with a sociologist friend in New York City a couple weeks ago, and the area is getting gentrified. It used to be kind of a poor area, but now there's a lot of wealthy apartments. I asked her, what's happening to the people who live here? She said, well, they're moving to Upper New York State. They're mostly black and women, and they're moving so they can be near where their husbands are in jail. So here's social policy for you. They gentrify the poor areas in New York City, get the women who are living there to go upstate so they can visit their husband in jail on Sunday. Okay. It's a kind of social policy. But the death penalty is just the worst aspect of this. And Troy Davis is a striking case. He's probably innocent, but even if he wasn't innocent, there was no proof that he was guilty. And it's pretty savage. We shouldn't be proud of the fact that we're standing alongside of China and Saudi Arabia.
So, how do you convince the government, United States government, to give up its all of these paid policies, right? We understand that yes, there are many problems, right? The government is obstacle. The U.S. is obstacle. U.S. government is obstacle to many like world peace, doing gross injustice to its own people. But how do you convince right, the government or the politicians, the corporations, right, these elites, to change their course of action, to change or to give up their policies? Is there any hope in that?
No more than you can change the Egyptian military to say, okay, we give up power. Or you can change, say, the Chinese Communist Party. You can't convince them to say, okay, we'll give up power. You force them to.
But again, in Egypt, right, the mass population forced Hosni Mubarak, and then again, it's like military, backed power to give up. But again, it came back, right? How do you see in any near future that is, like marginalized, right? Mass population, not elite, as Marx said, proletariat, right? Rising up and then changing the structure, not only in one geographic area, but throughout the world. Do you see any?
It's happened all through history. That's why we don't have kings and princes and slavery and so on. I mean, none of these things come as gifts from above. They're all won by struggle. And in fact, just in the last generation, there's been plenty of progress. And we saw how it was done. So I don't know what this college was like, but if you go to, say, my university, MIT, 50 years ago when I got there, if you walk down the halls, and I suspect it was the same here, what you saw was white males, well-dressed, deferential, doing their work, not raising a fuss, and so on. That was 50 years ago. If you walk down the halls today, it's half women, about a third minorities, informal dress, which reflects informal relations among people, and a lot of political activism. Well, where'd that come from? And that happened all over the country, in fact, all over the world, but in this country a lot. It came from popular activism, a lot of it students. We just changed consciousness and awareness and forced the governments to shift policies. It's as
Yes, please.
Yes, if you were President Obama, how do you try to confront the Congress and what do you think about them and what they are doing about trying to solve this economic crisis? And also, what do you think about the Occupy Wall Street?
Well, Occupy Wall Street is basically the answer to your question. I mean, it's the kind of popular movement which, if it expands and develops, could have the kind of effect that's led to humane changes in the past. It's a hard job, in other words. It's not as hard as it used to be. Like, you're not going to have the army come and shoot you. You want a lot more freedom than that. I mean, it did happen in the past, but it's not going to happen now. But yeah, that's the right sort of movement. If I was, there are things, Obama certainly has constraints, but there are things he could have done if he cared. And if he had any principles at all, which I don't think he does, there would have been substantial possibilities. So, for example, take right now the deficit that I was talking about. It would be perfectly possible for a president to do, say, what Roosevelt did. A large majority of the population, quite a large majority, thinks the way to deal with it, first of all, thinks the deficit isn't much of a problem. It's jobs that are a problem. So the president could say, okay, we're going to mobilize you, the population, to force through the things that you think are important, which happen to be correct. Okay? The corporations wouldn't have liked it, but there wasn't a lot they could do about it if he had done that. The same is true on, say, healthcare. There's pretty large majorities that have been in favor of national healthcare for a long time. Even when it came down to the public option, by about 3 to 2, the population was in favor of it. Obama just gave it away. The gifts to the pharmaceutical corporations. The U.S. is, I think, unique in having laws that bar the government from negotiating drug prices. About 85% of the population is against that. Obama gave it away. I mean, a political figure who had some principles could have said, well, okay, I'm going to stand up for the principles and I'll help mobilize the population to fight for them. They could have won. Now, it's not that there aren't going to be obstacles. Roosevelt had obstacles. Other political leaders who pushed through decent legislation have had obstacles, but they're not, they're not kind of graven in stone. And it's a pretty free country despite everything else. So you are pretty free from police repression. There's bad cases like right now in Davis, California, and so on. But it's not Egypt. It's certainly not Saudi Arabia. There's a lot more freedom and there's a lot more opportunity.
Yes.
I've had this thought rolling around in my head for most of this semester. And it kind of goes to what we were talking about just before about healthcare and about a couple other things. And I'm taking a class right now on propaganda and public opinion, so I was wondering about your thoughts. There seems to be this underlying tone right now in a lot of the Republican debates and things like that, that if people are willing to subjugate themselves to the wills of the market, that we will all end up better in the end. And I think economic theory has pretty classically shown that that's just not the case. Could you comment maybe on why this theory has kind of come around that subjugating people to markets instead of markets to people is somehow going to be good for the population as a whole?
First of all, remember that none of them believe it. I mean, that's pretty obvious. So, for example, there's the United States has a kind of a semi-market economy. I mean, I'm sure you use a computer and the internet and iPhones and all that kind of stuff. But most of that stuff comes out of the state sector. It's in the state sector for decades. That's where all the innovative research is done, the hard work and so on. Finally, after a long period, it's handed over to the private corporations to commercialize. So, for example, everybody now worships Steve Jobs. Okay, Steve Jobs was skilled at taking market pressures that, or, you know, entrepreneurial initiative, consumer choice that had anything to do with computers and the internet being developed for 30 years in the state sector. There's one part of the economy that does run pretty much by market principles since around 1980. That's the financial sector. Once the New Deal regulations were dissolved, then it became pretty much a market system. So it crashes every 2 years. And every time the first crash was in the early Reagan years. There were 2 more crashes during the Reagan years, then it crashed again under Clinton, and now it's crashed again massively. And of course, it's predictable. It's predictable just looking at the way markets work. You know, after all, how do markets work? So suppose I go into, you know, the Toyota place and I buy a car. Okay, there's a deal made between me and the guy who's selling the car. And if we're paying attention, we work out that deal so that it works out okay for us. You know, he makes a profit, I get a car. But there's something we don't pay attention to. It has a name in the economics literature. It's called externalities. It's a footnote. Take an economics course. A footnote there that says you don't pay attention to externalities. Externalities are the effect on others. So if I buy a car in the Toyota place, neither of us takes into account the effect on you. And there's an effect. There's more cars on the road, there's more pollution, there's congestion, there's the price of gas goes up, and so on. I mean, for each individual, it may be a small effect, but multiplied over a large part of the population, it's a large effect. And you don't account for that. Now, in the case of financial institutions, the thing that is not paid attention to is what's called systemic risk. So if Goldman Sachs, and again, I'm not telling you anything, it's a secret, you should learn this in an economics course. If Goldman Sachs makes a risky investment, meaning they get a lot of profit from it, if they're paying attention, they insure themselves against likely loss, but they don't insure the system against collapsing. That's what's called systemic risk. And it happens over and over again. So the risks, the collapses are just built into the system. However, since none of the people you're talking about believes in markets, they don't follow this to its conclusion. If they believed in markets, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, the Bank of America, they'd all be bankrupt. Because when they crash, okay, in a capitalist system, you're finished. You become a street sweeper. But that's not what happens. They call on the nanny state to bail them out. It's nothing to do with market systems. It has to do with systems that are run by private power for their own benefit.
How do you think that people these elites in power manage to convince the population so totally that these things are in their best interest when we can see through any basis that they're not?
I mean, they don't convince the population doesn't have a very clear picture of any of this. And in fact, popular attitudes by now are so confused that you just can't make any sense out of them. So it takes public attitudes are very carefully studied in the United States. One of the main topics of political science, and it's done well. If you take a look at public opinion studies are segmented, so you study particular segments of the population, and it's interesting. So if you study people who say Tea Party sympathizers, get the government off my back, that category, and you ask them what they think about particular issues, turns out they're mostly social democratic. So they think there should be more spending on health, more on education, more on assistance to, say, mothers with dependent children and so on, but not welfare. You can't have money for welfare because Reagan succeeded in demonizing welfare. Welfare means rich black women driving in their limousines to pick up your money for welfare state. Well, nobody wants that. So we want aid to women with dependent children, but not welfare. And it's the same on issue after issue. The attitudes are totally contradictory. Well, that's what propaganda has succeeded in doing is just confusing the hell out of people. So there's slogans which you're supposed to believe, but you really don't believe any of them, because when it gets down to the actual issues, your opinions are quite different. And that's a good situation in which popular organizing can proceed. Let's get people to think it through and figure it out and see what they actually want and what they can do with it.
Thank you, Dr. Chomsky. I think we close this session here at 6:30 after his lecture. We will give sessions with some of the at that point. Thank you, sir.